So I work at Axiomatics. We're a software vendor that specializes in authorization solutions. So any of my comments here will be with that kind of bias, with that kind of perspective. So please, take that to heart. I wanted to bring in a few different themes for my presentation. In the description, it was a little bit about the past, the current, and the future. And the way I look at these three different realms or eras, if you will, is the past is where your authorization was hard-coded into the application. You're using mechanisms like roles, groups, access control lists, and the like. I like to say the current mode is more about externalizing authorization from the application using techniques like attribute-based access control, or ABAC, OpenID Connect, or other OAuth variants. And then I've got a few ideas about the future, and I'm permitting we can have some questions, but really I want to throw out some different ideas in the last segment. It's an area where I don't have many answers, but I think there are some interesting questions to consider. And as a backdrop, we've really come from, to think about the context or the perspective that we hear customers talk, and just in talking to a lot of different organizations, this need to know model has really morphed into more of a need to share approach here. So if you think about the most sensitive, the most valuable, the most important data that you're a custodian for, well, that's exactly what you need to share with other individuals, whether it's across departments or agencies within an organization, with customers or other end users, with partners and the like. So it's, but it's a real challenge to make that happen with as little friction and as much security as possible. And there's a number of quotes that I've found over the years. I like to use a couple of them to also add some additional flavor or context to this notion. This is from James Clapper, I think he was DNI at the time, talking about just after September 11th here in the US, how the intelligence community was really compartmentalized and did not properly share data among the different agencies. But I found this quote also even more interesting from a couple of years earlier that talked about overcoming the default option in most organizations. If you think culturally about your organization, this default option of, well, I'm only going to share this if you really need to know it. I'm not really going to be that open with you. And moving to this culture of being more open, but within the right boundaries, I think this is really significant. And I hope to touch on it a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Because moving to this need to share model does require some change in technology, because we need to be more granular about that access. We need to be able to be more specific. But it also means a change in your thought process as an identity architect, a security architect. And technology like externalized authorization and ABAC only helps with one of those previous two options, right? It's not really going to help you with the organizational dynamics that you need to consider. And as a further backdrop, it's a good opportunity to rethink your authorization strategy within the context of some of these macro trends in the industry. We've all heard the buzzwords. They don't all affect everyone equally, but if big data is an issue for you, if mobile computing is a challenge for you, then it's also an opportunity to rethink your architecture or your approach to authorization and access control within your environments. So I would encourage you to think of it that way, because there's a number of concerns that you might have when you are sharing more data or trying to share data more freely with other parties. Privacy is a huge consideration. We've heard some other talks at this conference speak specifically about privacy and all the different angles to that topic. What we see is in healthcare and financial services, where you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, you have country-specific privacy rules that you must enforce, otherwise you're subject to very considerable fines. So that's a huge issue, a huge concern for a lot of organizations. And then are we exposing our companies to more risk than we can tolerate in some of these scenarios? And what about data leakage or the insider threat? Can we use newer authorization techniques to lower the attack surface of the insider threat issue? Because when we are trying to collaborate and share data, again, from our perspective, the precision here is one of the key things to consider. So that's sort of an intro or preamble to some of the other commentary. And next up, I'll start with sort of the before picture, or the past picture for access control. And what we see are a lot of organizations, a lot of applications that you might buy from software vendors essentially have the access control or the authorization logic built into the application. So this is all of the if-then-else kind of statements that you'll find scattered through the logic of the business application. One of our customers says they have, in the past, up to 10,000 lines of this kind of code within an application, which is just a nightmare to maintain, of course. But a lot of commercial applications, a lot of ERP systems have this kind of model hard-baked into that platform, into that application. So there's not a lot you as a customer could do about it. But certainly for the applications where you own the source code, again, you have an opportunity to change this model to something that's maybe a little more advanced and more efficient. And this is normally where you have logic to check if someone is in a group list, if they're in a role of doctor, then they can see the medical record and things of that nature. And I like to poke a lot of fun at roles and ABAC, and I use this line here, a role's got to know its limitations. And one of the larger issues that we see with customers is that they have a challenge in being able to define roles that are specific enough in their permission sets to actually support very dynamic and fine-grained access control scenarios. Because you have the typical case where you define, group or role A, and you define role C, each with respective permissions. Oh, by the way, I need another role C with some of those permissions from each of the two previous ones, and I potentially come up with toxic combinations, so now I have to create yet more and more roles to try to remove that situation. And we have some recent examples. You've lost control of your ABAC deployment when you have 7,000 customers and 93,000 roles. Real customer example who will remain unnamed. Or another case where an organization actually employs 50 people full-time just to review role assignments and do this search for any conflicts that could result in toxic combinations. So certainly we think there's a better way. However, if you're considering migrating from an ABAC or role-based model to an attribute or ABAC approach, there's one cautionary note I would make, and that is not to take your ABAC definitions and directly migrate them to an ABAC model, because the result is going to be that you'll end up with as many policies as you had roles. So the direct mapping is not the way to go here. Instead, I would suggest that you reorient to a new starting point. And I've got an example a little bit later in the presentation that goes through an example where, because in an attribute-based model, you have a policy language behind the system. So you're thinking more in natural language statements of how you permit or deny access. So you start out from that, point, and then you do incorporate your role definitions. So you actually leverage and extend them. You don't throw away your role definitions. In an ABAC system, roles are a first-rate attribute. So there's actually a way to leverage that investment and streamline some of that access control processing. So what are some of the issues around some of these, what I call legacy models? Well, the fact that it is hard-coded in the application means it's often difficult to actually audit and certify the environment to determine who has access to what. Darren might think otherwise in his next presentation, but that still is a challenge. Change control is definitely a huge issue here, because if you think about if any of those if-then-else routines need to change, well, you've got to change the source code, go through all of that production control and review before it can actually get implemented. We think it's not suitable. RBACs and group lists, they're not suitable for these really dynamic and more advanced or complex scenarios. And of course, you have the manageability challenge here if you're running into the role explosion issue. I will say, though, that using the right tool for the right problem is also very important. If you have basic access control needs, then you don't want to touch that system. You use it as is. Or if it's a commercial app where you don't own the source code, you have to basically live with what that ISV is implemented. Again, you're not going to try to retrofit those kind of environments. Okay, so what about some of the current approaches? And we talk a lot about attribute-based access control. Well, what is it? It's a means to externalize the authorization from your applications. That is, you have a centrally managed system where you define those access rules for permitting or denying access. And you have a runtime system that actually enforces those rules based on calls from your application. And I mentioned just a moment ago that there is also a policy language behind the system, and that's the glue that brings it all together for setting those conditions for access. That's why we call it attribute-based access control, another clever naming convention from the IT industry. And here's a basic architecture. And what's key here is that between the user, which could be a human, machine, or service account, and the application or resource, application, API, web service, database, you have this interceptor, and that's a key point here. So the interceptor is in the flow of that access. They're going to send a message off to an authorization service, and this didn't quite render, but it essentially says user Bob is trying to read record number 22. Here's where the authorization service has those policies. Another key aspect of this system is it can look up additional information about Bob or about this record and then render its decision. In this case, permit or deny. So this is the essence of an externalized authorization model. You see this similar thing in web access management tools. This is the reference architecture for the XACML standard, XACML standard. And some of the powerful aspects of an ABAC model is that it takes into account a lot of different context. It's not just who the user is and what role they're assigned at the moment, but what kind of device they have, where are they located, what time of day is it, what is their relationship to the data they're trying to access. So that in those complex scenarios, these are the kinds of things that are important for an authorization system to be able to accommodate. And here's one of an example of how you get started with an ABAC approach versus roles. With attribute-based, you start out with natural language statements like this. And you start to, you break out your highlighter and you look at different words here in the sentence. So brokers, that's a role that I need to use. View, here's one of the actions. The policies, the insurance policies in this case, so that's the resource. And then you can do things like accommodate the relationship of that broker to this particular insurance record. So this is how you approach an ABAC model. Whereas when you think about roles, you might say, well, what kind of roles do I need for this application or this line of business? What permissions do they need, and so on. Whereas in an ABAC model, you're talking more in the language of the business rather in the language of the IT person. And one interesting thing that's trending right now as we talk to customers in healthcare, insurance, property and casualty insurance, or other financial services is this notion of consent management. That is to allow end users to control who can see data. Sounds like UMA, right? User managed access in some ways. So the idea here is that the patient or the insurance customer has more control over maybe what doctors or what kind of specialists can see certain parts of their medical records, or with an insurance or financial services example, even members of a family, the parents can see the children's data, but not vice versa. And so there's a number of interesting scenarios here that are starting to become more and more prevalent. A lot of this driven by the increased focus on privacy regulations around the world. But here's some of the open questions I have. Where should this consent data be stored and managed? Should it be in the authorization service, like UMA, for example? Should it be in the application, the banking application or the health record management application? Both places, other places? I think this is important to think about because, personally, I think it should be closer to the application itself, not some external entity. But I think there's going to be fragments of components, preferences of the individual plus preferences or requirements imposed by the owning application or business. All right. So there are, even though we're fans of ABAC and externalized authorization, there are some potential issues here to think about. One is it's relatively new. When you think about the amount of time, the decades of time that we've been thinking about roles and group lists and the like, to change to a model that's based on policies and attributes, that's a big change in thinking in your approach. So it takes some time to get over that. I mentioned the fact that commercial apps often don't give you the hooks to externalize authorization, so you're stuck with what's in there already. And one thing to be sure of is, don't take a comprehensive or sophisticated solution and make your simple problem harder. We need to avoid that, but rather focus on those more complex scenarios where you do need a comprehensive and sophisticated solution to make those manageable and simpler. All right, a few things about the future in my remaining few minutes here. So even though we're a purveyor of externalized authorization systems, we think you've got to have a number of different tools in the toolbox. This isn't just I've got a hammer, whatever you've got looks like a nail to me. So remember I talked about in the architecture slide, an interceptor approach. I've got some kind of piece of code or a proxy in the flow of the application. Well, let's turn that around. What about if I can define your access rules for an application in the XACML standard, in that policy language standard, and then translate that into some other format, whether another standard or a proprietary format, and that target platform doesn't implement any kind of interceptor code, but it just goes about its normal operation. And one example of that is with Microsoft Windows Server 2012, where they introduced dynamic access control for file shares. So you can actually do this, author your policies for who can see what data in the file system, and translate that into what's called SDDL, Security Descriptor and Definition Language. You activate it in Windows Server, and when you double-click on that folder or that file, it goes along happily and makes its own decisions, but it's actually based on rules and policies that were managed outside of that environment. So it's pretty neat approach, and we think we need more of this, especially for those applications that use a legacy approach and you can't change the authorization model, but you might want to have more control and visibility of those access policies. Next one to think about. So in Federation, I'm assuming most of the audience here at this event knows about STSs, or Security Token Services, and how you can transform a SAML token into a WS-Fed token or OAuth token and things of that nature. What about Well, that's weird. I seem to have missed a few slides. Or they got reordered. I blame it on you, Hans. What about if we have an authorization token service? You know, there's so many apps, especially API applications, that use some variant of OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect tokens with scopes in them. But what you don't have is any kind of policy model to manage who has access to what scopes and the like. So what if we had things like this where I could input, you know, some user ID, I'm trying to access some kind of resource, and I put that into a policy engine that spits out some format of OAuth token. And I put various claims or scopes within that token. Or I could do this, you know, I could have a user ID set of claims and put it into a JWT token or a JSON web token. And there was another example I had in here of, you know, I just have a user ID and a resource type. Now tell me what scopes I can put in this OAuth token for that user. So I think there's a number of interesting scenarios here where we can combine some of the industry standards that are out there to, you know, give a little more clarity, a little more manageability over the OAuth authorization model. So again, something to think about. And then to wrap up, so I've covered a number of different topics here, tried to tie together some sort of distinctly different ideas, but you know, just to review a few of them, I do encourage you to think about authorization now within those new macro trends that are affecting all of us in the industry today. And are you able to take your existing models and apply them, or do you need to take advantage of some newer or different approaches? Roles and groups, they do work well within certain environments, but realize what their limits are and where you need to branch out beyond that. We do think externalized authorization continues to be on the upswing. Our friends at Gartner keeps telling us that ABAC is going to be adopted more and more over the next 5 years, and we definitely see that kind of interest. But there's still a lot of other exploration to be done out there. There's always a lot of more challenging and interesting scenarios to consider. So hopefully we can have a conversation about some of that offline. And I think I've run out of time, and I will thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Hans. Thank you. Yeah, do you? We'll take it offline, I think. Okay. If you like, sure.
So, is there anyone with a question? There's, I think, room for one question. Anyone with a burning question? Yeah. Please.
Okay, so for those that didn't hear it, he was commenting on when I talked about role explosion, if there's a similar issue with rule explosion. That's a good concern, but we have not seen that to be an issue. Because you have so many operators in the policy language, you can actually compress a fairly broad set of scenarios into a compact structure. So it's not been our experience where you have that issue, except where people do try to map directly from roles to the rules. We have seen cases where that does result in an equal number of policies and rules as you had roles previously. So part of that is just the skill of proper policy structure and modeling. I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you. Okay, yeah, conflicts between rules. Well, at least in the XACML policy language, you have the notion of combining algorithms, which set the precedence for dealing with conflicts. You know, if one rule says permit, the other says deny, well, which one rules? Is it deny overrides? Is it permit override? Is it first applicable, and so on? So that's built into the policy language. Okay?
All right.
All right.
Thank you.